By the Tsar's beard, is this thing actually transmitting? If you're receiving this, congratulations, you've tapped into the final glorious unraveling of Mother Russia. You're tuned in to the Petrograd perspective, broadcasting live, or more accurately, living on borrowed time, from the year of our Lord 1917, somewhere in a very, very agitated Petrograd. My name is Count Fyodor Volkov, and if the sheer impossible audacity of this transdimensional broadcast, from a moment when our empire is shedding its skin like a very confused snake, doesn't compel you to immediately smash that subscribe button and commit to witnessing history's greatest train wreck, then frankly you're beyond the reach of even the finest vodka. Do it now, before the Red Guard requisition your internet, and tell me, if this peculiar connection holds, from what strange corner of your world are you listening? What year has fate decreed for you? And what time do these dire, yet oddly entertaining, tidings reach you? We're cataloguing all anomalies. Now, pour yourself a shot, you'll need it, and let's dissect the glorious chaos. The Romanovs, a name that once meant the world. For 300 years it was a synonym for power, for God's own will manifest in a Tsar. Our world was one of crystal, gold, and the divine certainty that our rule was as eternal as the Russian winter. We waltzed through grand ballrooms, our laughter echoing over estates the size of small European countries. Stability, we called it, a magnificent, glorious, and, I admit, a terribly boring stability. Until, of course, it became 300 years of absolutely everything going wrong. We thought crisis was just a fancy French word we used for dramatic flair at dinner parties. As it turns out, it was to become our new national anthem, played on an orchestra of rattling machine guns and the mournful cries of the unwashed. It all began as a low rumble, a distant, ignorable hum beneath the cheerful clinking of our vodka glasses. The peasants, our beloved, simple-minded moujiks, started to get restless. For centuries they were as much a part of the landscape as the birch trees, content with their dirt and their devotion. But then, whispers of land and freedom began to drift up from the villages. It was terribly inconvenient. One can't possibly enjoy a good hunt when the beaters are muttering about agrarian reform. We saw it not as a genuine grievance, of course, but as a failure of imagination on their part. Why would anyone choose to complain when they could simply toil in blissful ignorance for the glory of the empire? It was all so dreadfully tiresome. Then came the cities, those ghastly, smoke-belching stains on our pristine landscape. A new breed of Russian was being forged in the fires of industry, and frankly, they were a vulgar lot. All soot, sweat, and syndicalism. They would bang on about working hours and living wages, as if such things were the concern of gentlemen. Their strikes became a seasonal annoyance, like mosquitoes in summer, disrupting the delivery of fine fabrics from France, and, on one particularly ghastly occasion, delaying a shipment of my favorite cigars. We, of course, paid it little mind. What is the grumbling of a few thousand factory workers against the might of an autocracy? It was a bad joke, a fleeting temper tantrum that would surely pass. To distract from the tedious noise at home, our dear cousins in government devised a brilliant plan, a short, victorious war. A little excursion to the east to put those upstart Japanese in their place. We all thought it was a splendid idea. It had all the thrilling elements of a grand imperial adventure. The papers were filled with caricatures of their little emperor, and we raised our glasses to the brave boys of the Baltic fleet. We imagined a swift, clean affair, a marvelous spectacle to unify the people and remind them of Russia's greatness. The war would be over by Christmas, we said. We just never specified which one. It was meant to be a tonic for the nation's morale, a swift demonstration of our superiority. Instead, it became the most embarrassing public spectacle one could imagine. Our mighty navy, sailing halfway around the world, was annihilated at a place called Tsushima in a matter of hours. It was more than a defeat. It was a social humiliation of the highest order. Imagine sending out an invitation to the world's most exclusive ball, only to have your carriage collapse in a muddy ditch right at the entrance. The Japanese, whom we considered little more than charmingly aggressive artisans, had thrashed the Russian bear. Back in St. Petersburg you could feel the shift. The jokes at our dinner parties acquired a sharper, more desperate edge. The empire wasn't just wobbling, it was stumbling around like a drunken guardsman. The hangover from our Japanese misadventure arrived in the winter of 1905. A priest of all people decided to lead a procession to the Winter Palace. A procession, as if the Tsar holds office hours for the general public. They carried icons and portraits of Nicholas, singing hymns, asking for, well, the usual peasant fare, bread, shorter work days, a bit of dignity. It was a hopelessly naive gesture and a catastrophic breach of etiquette. The response was, shall we say, unequivocal. The Imperial Guard met them not with tea and sympathy, but with rifle fire. It was a ghastly business, truly. The snow turned red, and the day was rather dramatically nicknamed Bloody Sunday. We saw it as a necessary, if messy, bit of housekeeping. The masses saw it as the ultimate betrayal. After the blood was cleaned from the cobblestones, the Tsar, in his infinite wisdom, decided to throw the dogs a bone. He issued something called the October Manifesto, a rather sentimental document promising civil liberties and an elected parliament, the Duma. A parliament. We laughed until we cried into our borscht. The very idea of it, inviting grimy workers and uneducated farmers to debate the governance of our sacred empire. It was like asking the horses to vote on the design of their own harnesses. We knew it was a hollow gesture, a theatrical performance to quiet the crowds, a way to put the lid back on the simmering pot before it boiled over entirely. For a time, it seemed to work. But the wobble, you see, never truly stopped. The Duma was dissolved and recalled at the Tsar's whim, a political plaything. The promises made in 1905 curdled into bitter resentment. The unrest didn't vanish. It simply went back underground, festering in dark cellars and radical reading groups, waiting for its moment. The ground beneath our feet had been permanently unsettled. The foundations of our 300-year-old palace were cracked, and strange new drafts were blowing through the corridors. The name Lenin, once an obscure joke, was now being whispered with a terrifying seriousness. The bad joke of imperial stability was over, and the punchline we feared was waiting right at our gates, holding a gun in one hand and a revolution in the other. If this glimpse into our glorious decadent decay has captured your imagination, if you wish to pour another glass and listen to the symphony of a dying empire, then you must commit to our cause. Do not let this broadcast be lost to the static of history. Secure your place in our circle by striking the subscribe button now. Do it with the force of a Cossack's charge. Ring the notification bell as if you are sounding the alarm for the fall of the Winter Palace, for we have many more stories to tell from the edge of the abyss. Subscribe before there's nothing left to broadcast but the silence. Just when we thought the Imperial ship couldn't possibly take on any more water, along came the summer of 1914. A Serbian radical, a name I can't be bothered to remember, decided to shoot an Austrian archduke in Sarajevo. A dreadfully common affair, really, but one that our interconnected, inbred royal houses of Europe decided was worth turning into a continental bloodbath. Suddenly, all the talk of strikes and peasant uprisings vanished, drowned out by a deafening chorus of God Save the Tsar. It was a miracle of social cohesion, a wave of patriotic fervor that swept everyone, from the highest prince to the lowest stable boy, into a state of hysterical unity. We were going to defend our Serbian brothers. We were going to thrash the Kaiser. The mood in St. Petersburg was electric. The city, which we hastily renamed Petrograd to sound less German, a cosmetic change of the most profound stupidity, was awash with flags and marching bands. Officers in freshly pressed uniforms strode about, basking in the adoration of weeping ladies who threw flowers at their feet. It was all terribly romantic, like something out of a Tolstoy novel, but with less philosophical meandering and more opportunities for day drinking. We toasted to a swift victory, to the glory of Holy Russia, and to the health of the Tsar. Young men, boys really, flocked to the enlistment stations, their eyes gleaming with visions of glory and adventure. They were convinced they were marching off to a grand, heroic crusade. We, of course, knew it was simply the next chapter in our long, complicated and often violent family saga. This initial euphoria was a potent, intoxicating drug. It felt as though the troubles of 1905 were but a bad dream. The grumbling workers and the sullen peasants were now our brave soldiers, united in their love for the motherland. In the salons and drawing rooms, the The war was the only topic of conversation. We spread out maps across billiard tables, tracing the advance of our glorious armies with the tips of our fingers, speculating on when we would be dining in Berlin. There was a genuine belief, even among the most cynical of us, that this war would be the very thing to save the autocracy. It would cleanse the nation of its revolutionary fevers and remind the world, and ourselves, of Russia's indomitable spirit. How naive we were! It's almost charming in retrospect to think we were ever that innocent. The spirit, as it turned out, was more than willing, but the flesh, and more importantly the industrial capacity, was pathetically weak. Our patriotic songs were loud, but the clatter of our factories was a faint, struggling whimper. We had the largest army in the world, a seemingly endless supply of men to throw at the German war machine. What we lacked, however, was everything else. Rifles, ammunition, artillery shells, boots, medicine, even food. It was a logistical nightmare of truly epic proportions, a testament to decades of corruption, mismanagement, and a fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare. We sent our brave boys to the front, sometimes with one rifle for every 3 soldiers, with the absurd instruction to pick up the weapon of a fallen comrade. It's the sort of strategy one might devise after consuming an entire bottle of vodka, yet it was our official military doctrine. The stories that trickled back from the front were less about heroic charges and more about a desperate, bloody struggle for survival. Our generals, bless their aristocratic hearts, were brilliant at commanding cavalry charges and planning parade ground maneuvers. They were, however, utterly clueless when faced with the grim reality of machine guns and heavy artillery. They were playing chess, while the Germans were playing a different game entirely, one that involved high explosives and industrial-scale slaughter. The first great shock came from East Prussia at a place called Tannenberg. It was supposed to be a triumphant Russian pincer movement, a crushing blow to the German Eighth Army. Instead, it was a catastrophe, a humiliation that made the defeat at Tsushima look like a minor sporting loss. Our Second Army was encircled and completely obliterated. The commanding general, Samsonov, a man of considerable girth and questionable tactical ability, wandered into the forest and shot himself rather than face the Tsar. It was a dramatic gesture, I suppose, but it did little to change the fact that we had lost over 100,000 men in a single disastrous battle. The news was suppressed, of course, but whispers of the disaster spread through Petrograd like a contagion. The losses were simply staggering, beyond anything we could have imagined. In the first year of the war alone, we lost millions of men, killed, wounded, captured. They vanished into the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. The initial patriotic fervor began to curdle into a bitter, silent grief. The trains that had once departed for the front, filled with singing soldiers, now returned bearing an endless cargo of the dead and maimed. The sight of limbless veterans begging on the streets of Petrograd and Moscow became commonplace. The romantic illusion of the war was shattered, replaced by the grim reality of a relentless, insatiable slaughterhouse. We marched off to war, singing hymns. We came back in coffins, or without legs, singing very different tunes. Turns out, German artillery doesn't care for imperial dignity. The industrial unpreparedness was a joke, but no one was laughing. Factories that were supposed to be churning out artillery shells were instead producing defective duds due to a lack of skilled labor and raw materials. The railway system, the pride of our modernization efforts, under Whitty, ground to a halt. It was incapable of simultaneously transporting troops to the front and food to the cities. The ply lines broke down completely. Soldiers at the front starved, while mountains of grain rotted in railway sidings hundreds of miles away. The incompetence was breathtaking. It was as if the entire state apparatus was designed with the express purpose of failing in the most spectacular way possible. In the cities, the consequences were dire. The lack of food led to shortages, and shortages led to queues. Long, silent, and increasingly angry queues of women and old men, waiting for hours in the bitter cold for a loaf of stale bread. These bread lines became the new social clubs of the urban poor, places where discontent was nurtured and revolutionary ideas were exchanged like recipes. The war, which was meant to unite the nation, was instead cleaving it in two. There was the Russia of the front, a hell of mud, blood, and futility, and the Russia of the rear, a grim world of hunger, cold, and simmering rage. The disconnect was total and utterly unsustainable. And what of our beloved Tsar during all this? In the face of this unfolding cataclysm, Nicholas made a decision of such monumental folly that it still beggars belief. In the autumn of 1915, he decided to dismiss his uncle, the Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, and take personal command of the army. He, an autocrat with no military experience to speak of, would lead our glorious troops to victory. It was a move born of desperation and a deluded sense of divine duty. He believed his presence at the front would inspire the soldiers and turn the tide of the war. A more self-destructive act of hubris is difficult to imagine. The practical effect of this decision was to leave the government in Petrograd in the hands of his wife, the Empress Alexandra, and her bizarre holy man, Grigory Rasputin. While the Tsar was off playing commander-in-chief at the military headquarters in Mogilev, the real power fell to a hysterical woman and a debauched Siberian peasant. The result was what we came to call ministerial leapfrog. Competent ministers were dismissed and replaced by a succession of Rasputin's cronies, each more inept and corrupt than the last. The government descended into a chaotic farce, a circus of incompetence that paralyzed what little effective administration remained. Rasputin's influence was the talk of every salon, every dinner party, and every bread queue. The stories were wild, lurid, and largely true. He was said to control the Empress completely, using his hypnotic gaze and his supposed healing powers over the young Tsarevich to manipulate state policy. His drunken orgies and his scandalous appointments made a mockery of the monarchy. The sacred aura of the Tsar, already tarnished by defeat and incompetence, was now utterly degraded. He was no longer the divine father of his people, he was the cuckolded husband of a German woman who was in thrall to a demonic charlatan. The damage to the prestige of the Romanov dynasty was irreparable. Meanwhile, at the front, the Tsar's presence did nothing to change the military situation. The Germans continued to advance, and our losses continued to mount. The only difference was that now, every defeat, every retreat, every botched offensive was laid directly at the feet of Nicholas himself. He had tied his own fate, and the fate of the dynasty, to the outcome of the war. He had made himself personally responsible for the slaughter and the starvation. It was a gamble of the highest stakes, and one he was destined to lose in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The emperor had no clothes, and now he was standing in the middle of a battlefield for all to see. The war exposed the rotten core of the Russian state like nothing before it. It revealed the hollowness of our military might, the fragility of our industry, and the utter bankruptcy of our political system. The autocracy, which had always justified its existence through its claim to be the sole guarantor of Russia's strength and stability, was now revealed as the primary architect of its weakness and chaos. The social contract, such as it was, had been broken. The people had given their sons, their labor, and their loyalty to the war effort, and in return they had received nothing but death, hunger, and humiliation. The great patriotic embrace of 1914 had become a fatal death grip. The air in Petrograd grew thick with a sense of impending doom. The old certainties were gone, replaced by a gnawing anxiety and a pervasive sense of dread. Even among the aristocracy the mood had soured completely. The initial jingoistic fervor had evaporated, replaced by a desperate, cynical gallows humor. We continued our routines, the balls, the operas, the endless glasses of vodka, but it was a frantic, joyless pantomime. We were dancing on the edge of a volcano, and we could feel the ground trembling beneath our polished boots. The sound of the war was no longer a distant drumbeat, it was a deafening roar, and it was getting closer every day. The fatal embrace with folly was tightening, and we were all beginning to suffocate. The staggering scale of our military blunders, the sheer artistic incompetence of it all, is a story that deserves to be told in its entirety. It's a tragedy of epic proportions, a dark comedy of errors played out on a stage of millions of square miles with a cast of millions of doomed souls. To truly appreciate the depth of our folly, you must continue to listen to this broadcast from the brink. Don't let these tales of monumental failure fade into obscurity. Preserve this testament to imperial collapse by subscribing to our channel. Hit that button with the grim determination of a soldier fixing his bayonet for a hopeless charge. Activate all notifications so you don't miss a single dispatch from our descent into madness. Join us, for the final act is about to begin, and you won't want to miss the curtain fall. While the flower of our nation's youth was being ground into fertilizer on the Eastern Front, a different kind of rot was eating away at the very heart of the empire, a rot with a long, filthy beard, hypnotic eyes, and the stench of unwashed peasant about him. His name was Grigory Rasputin. Ah, Rasputin, our dear mystic friend. He could heal the Tsarevich, apparently, but couldn't cure the empire of its rampant insanity, or his own bad breath, for that matter. He arrived in St. Petersburg as a curiosity, a Siberian holy man, a starets, with a reputation for spiritual wisdom and, more importantly, for a certain rustic magnetism that the ladies of the court found inexplicably alluring. Initially, he was just another spiritual fad, like table-turning or French poetry. The drawing rooms of the capital were always searching for new diversions, and a genuine, unwashed man of God from the depths of Siberia was a novelty of the highest order. He would speak of scripture in simple, earthy terms, his eyes blazing with a frightening intensity. He drank like a fish, and his table manners were appalling, but he had a charisma that was as undeniable as it was unsettling. We, the old nobility, watched with a mixture of amusement and disdain. We had seen these holy fools come and go. We assumed he would have his moment, fleece a few guilt-ridden countesses, and then disappear back into the obscurity from whence he came. But Rasputin was different. He had an ace up his sleeve, a key that would unlock the door not just to the salons of the aristocracy, but to the private chambers of the imperial palace itself. That key was the Tsarevich Alexei, the heir to the throne. The boy, as we all knew in hushed tones, suffered from hemophilia, the royal disease. The slightest bump or scrape could trigger a life-threatening bleed. The finest doctors in Europe were powerless, able to do little more than watch and wait as the child suffered in agony. The Empress Alexandra, a woman already prone to mysticism and anxiety, was utterly desperate. She would have turned to a talking horse if she thought it could save her son. And so, in 1905, Rasputin was summoned to the palace. During one of Alexei's bleeding episodes, when the doctors had given up hope, Rasputin apparently calmed the boy, prayed over him, and the bleeding stopped. Was it a miracle, hypnosis, a lucky coincidence? Who knows? Frankly, who cares? The result was all that mattered. From that moment on, in the eyes of the Empress, Rasputin was not just a holy man, he was a saint, a direct messenger from God sent to protect her precious son and the future of the dynasty. Her faith in him became absolute, unshakable, and blind to all reason. This gave the mad monk an unprecedented level of access and influence. He became our friend, a permanent fixture in the imperial household. His word was gospel. His advice on matters both spiritual and increasingly political was treated as divine revelation by the Empress. She saw his peasant wisdom as a pure, uncorrupted channel to the soul of the Russian people, a refreshing antidote to the cynical and self-serving counsel of us, the nobility. She failed to realize that his self-interest was perhaps the most potent of all, cloaked as it was in the guise of holy simplicity. He was a master manipulator, and in the Empress he had found the perfect subject. When the Great War began and the Tsar made his disastrous decision to go to the front, Rasputin's power multiplied exponentially. With Nicholas away playing soldier, Alexandra was left as the de facto ruler in Petrograd. And who was whispering in her ear, guiding her hand and dictating her decisions? Our unwashed Siberian mystic. He began to meddle in affairs of state with the confidence of a born autocrat. Ministers who questioned his influence or tried to warn the Empress were dismissed in an instant. They were replaced by his own appointees, a parade of incompetent sycophants and outright scoundrels, whose only qualification was their loyalty to Rasputin. The government descended into chaos, a grotesque puppet show with Rasputin pulling the strings and the Empress as his willing marionette. We called it the ministerial leapfrog. the Minister of the Interior, the Minister of War, the Procurator of the Holy Synod, all were replaced at a dizzying pace based on the whims and visions of a man who could barely write his own name. It was said he would meet with prospective ministers, stare into their eyes, and declare them fit or unfit for office based on some mystical intuition. The serious business of running a vast, crumbling empire at war was being conducted like a back-alley séance. Of course, with this power came scandal. The rumors about Rasputin were legion, and they spread like wildfire through the starving cities and the demoralized army. They were whispered in bread queues and shouted in clandestine revolutionary meetings. His debauchery was legendary. He was a prodigious drinker and a voracious womanizer. Stories of his orgies, attended by high society ladies who sought his blessing, were common knowledge. He would boast of his conquests, even claiming to have the Empress herself as his lover. These tales, often embellished with pornographic woodcuts and satirical poems, destroyed the last vestiges of respect for the imperial family. The Empress was no longer seen as the pious mother of the nation, but as the German woman, a foreign spy in the pocket of a depraved charlatan. The Tsar was a weak-willed fool, a cuckold who had abandoned his throne to a mad monk. The sacred image of the autocracy, the foundation of its power, was being dragged through the filthiest gutters of public opinion. It didn't matter if the most lurid rumors were true. People believed them. They saw the chaos in the government, the defeats at the front, the hunger in the cities, and they saw Rasputin at the center of it all, a demonic puppet master orchestrating the downfall of Russia. His presence was a national humiliation. It was one thing to be losing a war to the Germans. That was a matter of industrial and military failure. It was another thing entirely to be governed by a lecherous, drunken peasant from Tobolsk. It offended our sense of order, our pride, our very Russianness. The anger cut across all classes. The common people saw him as a devil, the clergy saw him as a heretic, and we, the aristocracy, saw him as the final, unforgivable insult, the symbol of a system that had lost its mind. He was a cancer on the body politic, and we knew that if he was not cut out, the entire organism would die. Several attempts were made to warn the Tsar, to make him see the abyss he was leading the country into. His own family members pleaded with him. The president of the Duma, Mikhail Rodzianko, gave him a detailed report on Rasputin's misdeeds, a document that would make a sailor blush. Nicholas's reaction was always the same, a stubborn refusal to listen, a quiet insistence that Rasputin was a simple man of God and that these were all malicious slanders. He would hear no evil of the man who he believed kept his son alive. His loyalty to his wife, and her loyalty to our friend, superseded all logic, all evidence, and all pleas for sanity. And so, a conspiracy began to form. If the Tsar would not remove the source of the rot, then others would have to do it for him. This was not a plot hatched by wild-eyed revolutionaries in some smoky basement. This was a conspiracy of the highest order, born in the palaces of Petrograd. The chief architects were Prince Felix Yusupov, a flamboyant and obscenely wealthy young aristocrat married to the Tsar's own niece, the Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's cousin, and Vladimir Purishkevich, a fanatical right-wing politician in the Duma. They were an unlikely trio of assassins, but they were united by a desperate patriotic conviction that they had to kill Rasputin to save Russia. The plan they concocted was as theatrical and chaotic as Rasputin's own life. In December of 1916, Yusupov lured Rasputin to his magnificent Moika palace on the pretext of meeting his beautiful wife, Irina. There, in a lavishly decorated basement cellar, they fed him cakes and Madeira wine, laced with enough cyanide to kill a dozen men. To their astonishment, the poison seemed to have no effect. Rasputin ate the cakes, drank the wine, and asked for some music. A panicked Yusupov, seeing his plan fail, ran upstairs, grabbed a revolver from Dmitri, came back down, and shot Rasputin in the chest. Even then, the mad monk refused to die. After being left for dead, he suddenly revived, clawed his way up the stairs, and staggered out into the palace courtyard, roaring like a wounded animal. Purishkevich, the politician, gave chase, firing several more shots. Finally, Rasputin collapsed into a snowbank, To be absolutely certain, the conspirators bound his body with ropes, drove it to the Petrovsky Bridge, and dumped it through a hole in the ice into the freezing Neva River. It was a brutal, frantic, and almost farcical end to a brutal and farcical life. When his body was recovered days later, the autopsy found water in his lungs. The unkillable devil, it seemed, had finally drowned. The news of his death was met with widespread rejoicing. In the streets of Petrograd, strangers embraced. In the salons, we toasted the assassins as national heroes. We truly believed that with Rasputin gone, the spell would be broken, the Empress would awaken from her trance, the Tsar would see reason, and the government could be restored to some semblance of sanity. We thought we had excised the tumor and saved the patient. But we were wrong. The cancer was not just Rasputin, it was the entire system. His death did not solve the crisis, it was merely a symptom of it, and his murder was simply the last, desperate act of a ruling class that had lost all control. The shadow he cast was long, and even in death it lingered, paving the way for the darkness to come. This tale of mysticism, madness, and murder at the heart of our dying empire is almost too bizarre to be believed, isn't it? If you find yourself captivated by this descent into chaos, if you need to know what happens when the so-called saviors become assassins, then you have found your home. Do not allow this broadcast to be drowned out by the coming storm. Secure its legacy by subscribing to our channel. Strike that subscribe button with the finality of a bullet from Purishkevich's revolver. Ring the notification bell to ensure you catch every last whisper from the Romanov court before it is silenced forever. You simply must subscribe, because the story is far, far from over. One's world has truly been turned upside down when the most compelling drama in the capital is no longer found at the Mariinsky Theatre, but in the queue outside the local bakery. The Great War, in its infinite capacity for grim irony, had managed to achieve the impossible. It had made the simple act of acquiring a loaf of bread the central, all-consuming obsession of an entire city. We, of course, were largely insulated from the worst of it, but one couldn't help but notice the changing scenery. The once grand avenues of Petrograd had been transformed into vast open-air waiting rooms, filled with shivering, sullen people. It was all terribly unaesthetic. It began subtly, as most catastrophes do. A rumor of a delayed flour shipment here, a slightly smaller loaf there. We barely noticed. Our pantries were full, our cellars well stocked with wine and preserves. The war was an abstract concept, a matter of maps and casualty lists in the morning papers. But then the problem began to metastasize. The war effort, that great ravenous beast, was devouring everything. It took the farmers for the army, the horses for the cavalry, and the trains for the troops. The exquisitely inefficient machinery of our imperial bureaucracy, which struggled at the best of times, simply collapsed under the strain. The result was a city of millions, slowly, inexorably beginning to starve. The queues became a permanent feature of the urban landscape. They would form in the pre-dawn darkness, long serpentine lines of women, children, and old men, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and weary resignation. They would wait for hours in the biting Russian winter, their breath pluming in the frigid air, all for the chance to buy a piece of coarse black bread that was often adulterated with sawdust or straw. We used to queue for opera tickets, for a glimpse of the prima ballerina. Now the masses queued for sustenance, and sometimes there was no bread, just more queue. It was truly a masterclass in bureaucratic ineptitude. Then came the inflation, a disease that infected every corner of the economy. The government, in its infinite wisdom, decided to pay for the war by simply printing more money. The result was predictable. The ruble became practically worthless. Prices for everything skyrocketed. A bag of potatoes that cost a ruble before the war now cost 20. A pair of boots, if you could even find them, cost a fortune. For us it was an annoyance. It meant the cost of champagne went up, and one had to be slightly more discerning with one's tailor. For the factory worker earning a pittance, or the soldier's wife living on a meager government stipend, it was a death sentence. Their wages were meaningless, their savings wiped out overnight. The contrast between our world and theirs became obscene. While they shivered in bread lines, we still held our dinner parties. The vodka still flowed, the caviar was still served on ice, though perhaps with a little less frequency. We would complain about the difficulty of finding good French cheese, while outside our frosted windows, people were fainting from hunger. It created a chasm between the classes that was no longer bridgeable. We weren't just living in a different world, we were living on a different planet, one that was, for the moment, still supplied by a private larder and a well-stocked wine cellar. But we could hear the rumblings from their world, and they were growing louder. The women were the heart of this new, hungry Petrograd. With their husbands and sons at the front, they were left to manage the impossible calculus of survival. They were the ones who stood in the queues, who faced the empty shelves and the sneering shopkeepers. They were the ones who had to look into the eyes of their hungry children and explain why there was no food. Their patience, worn thin by years of war and loss, was beginning to fray. Their conversations in the queues, once filled with gossip and prayer, were now laced with a bitter, dangerous anger. They were no longer just complaining about the price of bread. They were questioning the very system that had led them to this point. The authorities, naturally, were completely clueless. Their response to the growing unrest was a mixture of denial and brute force. They would send out the police or a detachment of Cossacks to disperse the crowds. They would issue official proclamations, assuring the public that the supply situation was under control and that there was no cause for alarm. It was like trying to put out a house fire with a glass of water. They simply could not comprehend the depth of the people's misery. They saw the queues not as a sign of a failing state, but as a problem of public order, a nuisance to be managed. They were deaf, dumb, and blind to the reality of the streets. The winter of 1916 into 1917 was the breaking point. It was a winter of exceptional cold, even for Russia. The canals froze solid, and the railway lines were buried under feet of snow. The already crippled supply system ground to a complete halt. Fuel ran out. People were freezing in their apartments, burning their own furniture for warmth, and the food disappeared entirely. The bread queues became bread riots. A bakery that was rumored to have received a shipment of flour would be stormed by a desperate mob. The veneer of civilization was cracking, revealing the raw, primal desperation beneath. It was hunger, pure and simple, that lit the final fuse, not grand political theories or the writings of some German intellectual in Zurich. It was the gnawing emptiness in the pit of the stomach, the primal rage of a mother who cannot feed her child. The revolution, when it came, didn't start with a proclamation or a storming of the palace. It started on International Women's Day, the 23rd of February, by our old calendar. It started when the women of the Viborg district, the city's industrial heartland, finally had enough. They left their factories, poured into the streets, and marched towards the center of the city, chanting not for all power to the Soviets, but for a much simpler, more urgent demand: bread. Their protest was spontaneous, leaderless, and infectious. As they marched, they were joined by others, workers from neighboring factories, students, shopkeepers, even some soldiers who were supposed to be keeping order. The crowd swelled from thousands to tens of thousands. They overwhelmed the police checkpoints, their sheer numbers making a mockery of any attempt to stop them. They were not an army, but they had a power that no army could match, the power of collective desperation. They had nothing left to lose. We watched these events unfold from our windows with a sense of detached curiosity, as if observing a peculiar natural phenomenon, like a swarm of locusts. It was certainly a disruption. The noise was dreadful, and it made getting around the city a terrible chore. We assured ourselves that it would pass. The Tsar was at the front, but the government would surely get the situation under control. The Cossacks would be sent in, a few heads would be cracked, and order would be restored. It had always worked before. We poured another drink and waited for the unpleasantness to be over. But this time was different. When the Cossacks were ordered to charge the crowds, something extraordinary happened. They didn't. These fearsome horsemen, the traditional enforcers of the Tsar's will, hesitated. They trotted their horses slowly, almost apologetically, through the throngs of protesters. In some cases they were seen smiling, even winking at the women who offered them bread. They were peasants themselves under their uniforms, and they understood the hunger of the people. The whip for the first time had refused to crack. This was the moment we should have understood that the game was over. The mutiny of the Cossacks was the first crack in the dam. The next day, the soldiers of the Petrograd garrison, the last line of defense for the autocracy, began to waver. These were not the hardened veterans of the front, but raw recruits, mostly older men and boys drawn from the same peasant and working-class stock as the protesters. They were tired, demoralized, and hungry. They had more in common with the people in the streets than with the distant, godlike Tsar they were supposed to be defending. When the orders came to fire on the crowds, some regiments obeyed, killing dozens, but others refused. They turned on their own officers, shot them down in the street, and joined the revolution. The city descended into anarchy. The police vanished, their stations burned to the ground. The symbols of imperial power, the courts, the ministries, the statues of the Tsars, were attacked and defaced. The arsenal was broken into, and rifles were distributed among the workers. The sound of sporadic gunfire became the new soundtrack of the city. It was no longer a protest, it was an armed insurrection, and there was no one left to stop it. The government, that hollow shell of Rasputin's cronies, simply evaporated. The ministers were arrested, hiding in their apartments like frightened children. The entire structure of the autocracy, which had stood for 300 years, crumbled into dust in a matter of days. The food queue follies had reached their spectacular, bloody climax. The hunger that had started as a low rumble had become a revolutionary roar. The empty shelves and the worthless rubles had done more to destroy the Romanov dynasty than any army or any political party. It was a lesson in the simple, brutal arithmetic of power. A government that cannot feed its people cannot govern its people. From the comfort of our drawing rooms, we had watched the greatest empire on earth be brought to its knees by a loaf of black bread. The irony was so thick you could have spread it on toast, if only we'd had any. If you are morbidly fascinated by this slow-magnated collapse, this masterclass in how to starve your own capital into open rebellion, then you are in the right place. This is a story that needs to be heard. Support our ongoing famine reports from the heart of a dying empire. Don't let this broadcast fall silent. Hit that subscribe button before the urgency of a mob breaking down a bakery door. You must subscribe, because the hunger is only just beginning, and the main course of this revolution is yet to be served. The end of our world did not arrive with a thunderous clap of divine judgment, as one might have expected. It began, rather ignominiously, with the shrill cries of factory women demanding bread. It was the 23rd of February 1917, a date that will forever be etched in my memory as the day the rabble truly lost its collective mind. We had seen protests before, of course. They were a seasonal nuisance, like flies in the summer, but this was different. This was a leaderless, shapeless, and terrifyingly earnest outpouring of pure, unadulterated frustration. It was the collective roar of an empty stomach, and it was about to deafen us all. It started in the Viborg district, that dreary industrial part of the city one tries to avoid at all costs. The women, tired of the endless queues and the phantom bread, simply walked out of their textile mills. They marched through the streets, their voices raw, chanting for food. It was meant to be a simple protest, a cry for help, but it became a contagion. They went to the neighboring metalworks, calling out the men, shaming them, pelting their windows with snowballs until they too downed their tools and joined the swelling crowds. It was a revolution born of social pressure and a desperate shared hunger. We, in our warm drawing rooms, dismissed it as another bout of peasant hysteria. Let them have their little parade, we said, pouring another glass of vodka. They'll tire themselves out and go home when they're cold. The authorities thought the same. The Tsar was hundreds of miles away at military headquarters in Mogilev, playing at being a soldier. The Empress was in the palace, likely praying with some new mystic she'd found to replace Rasputin. For the government ministers, that rotating cast of incompetence assured everyone that the situation was under control. They had the police, they had the garrison. What could a few thousand hysterical women and disgruntled workers possibly do? What they did was multiply. The next day, 200,000 workers were on strike. The day after that, even more. The city ground to a halt. Trams stopped running, shops were shuttered, and the central artery of the city, the Nevsky Prospect became the sole property of the demonstrating masses. They surged across the frozen Neva River from the industrial districts, a great grey tide of humanity flooding the pristine heart of the capital. The slogans began to change. Bread was now joined by a more ominous chant, "Down with the autocracy." It was all getting terribly out of hand. The first real moment of panic, the first inkling that our world was truly cracking, came with the Cossacks. These traditionally brutal enforcers of the Tsar's will were sent to disperse the crowds, their whips at the ready. We expected to hear the familiar screams, the sound of leather on flesh that usually signaled the end of such gatherings. Instead, a strange, unsettling silence fell. The Cossacks rode among the protesters, but their whips remained coiled. They were seen smiling, sharing jokes with the very people they were meant to be trampling. A Cossack, they say, even bowed to the crowd. It was a terrifying piece of street theatre, a clear sign that the instruments of repression were broken. Then came the turning point, the act from which there was no return. The soldiers of the Petrograd garrison, our last line of defense, were ordered to fire on the crowds. These were not seasoned troops, but a motley collection of raw recruits and older reservists, weary of the war and sympathetic to the plight of their fellow citizens. In some places they obeyed the order, and blood stained the snow. But in the barracks of the Pavlovsky, Volensky, and Litovsky regiments, the soldiers made a different choice. They shot their officers, the ones who had given the fatal command, and poured out of their barracks to join the revolution, their bayonets now pointed in a new direction. The city descended into a state of absolute chaos. It was as if the laws of social physics had been suspended. Policemen were hunted down and killed, their stations set ablaze, the courts of justice were ransacked, their archives flung into bonfires, the prisons were stormed, and thousands of criminals and political prisoners were released onto the streets, adding a new, unpredictable element to the mayhem. The sound of celebratory and sometimes not so celebratory gunfire was constant. The symbols of 300 years of Romanov rule were being systematically dismantled by a leaderless, joyous, and terrifyingly angry mob. While Petrograd burned, the Tsar was in a state of blissful ignorance, stuck on the imperial train, trying to get back to the capital. He sent frantic telegrams ordering loyal troops to be dispatched, but his orders were either ignored or impossible to carry out. The railway workers, now loyal to the revolution, diverted his train, shunting him onto a side track at a provincial station called Pskov. The ruler of all the Russias, the absolute autocrat, was a prisoner of his own railway network. The irony would have been delicious had the situation not been so dire. Back in Petrograd, a strange new power structure was emerging from the chaos. On one hand, you had the Provisional Committee of the Duma, a collection of liberal politicians and aristocrats like myself, desperately trying to steer the revolution in a respectable, orderly direction. We saw ourselves as the rightful inheritors of power, the only ones capable of preventing the country from sliding into total anarchy. We envisioned a constitutional monarchy, a polite, Western-styled government where we, naturally, would be in charge. It was a noble, if completely delusional, ambition. On the other hand, and in the very same building, the Taurid Palace, another power was taking shape, the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. This was a far more radical and chaotic assembly, a throwback to the revolutionary councils of 1905. It was a raucous, smoky, and intensely democratic body, where any factory or regiment could send a delegate. They were the ones who truly had the support of the masses and, more importantly, the soldiers. They issued their own decrees, the most famous being Order No. 1, which effectively transferred all military authority from the officers to elected soldiers' committees. In a single stroke, they had destroyed the army as a disciplined fighting force. This created the absurd situation we called dual power, or as I preferred to call it, dual incompetence. The provisional government had the official authority but no real power. The Soviet had the real power but no official authority. We in the government couldn't even get a light bulb changed without the permission of some surly soldier from the Soviet. It was a farcical arrangement, a government with two heads, both of them screaming at each other, while the body of the state bled out on the floor. It was in this chaotic context that the final act of the Romanov dynasty played out. A delegation from the Duma traveled to Pskov to meet the stranded Tsar. There, on his train, surrounded by mutinous generals who told him the war effort was doomed if he did not step down, Nicholas finally bowed to the inevitable. On the 2nd of March, he signed the instrument of abdication. He didn't just abdicate for himself, but also for his son Alexei, passing the crown to his brother, the Grand Duke Michael. It was a desperate last-ditch attempt to save the dynasty. The news of the abdication reached us in Petrograd, and for a moment we in the provisional government thought we had won. We had our constitutional monarchy, the revolution could be contained, our new prime minister, Prince Lvov, was ecstatic. But we had misjudged the mood of the streets entirely. When the Grand Duke Michael was announced as the new Tsar, the reaction was not one of relief, but of fury. The people had not overthrown one Romanov just to get another. The cry went up, "We want a republic." The revolution, it turned out, had a momentum of its own, and it had no intention of stopping for us. Grand Duke Michael, a man of far more sense than his brother, read the writing on the wall. After a single day as the nominal ruler of Russia, he too abdicated, stating that he would only accept the crown if it were offered to him by a future constituent assembly. And just like that, it was over. 304 years of Romanov rule gone. Wiped away in less than a week. One minute we had a Tsar, an autocrat appointed by God. The next, he was just gone. Just a private citizen named Nicholas Romanov, under house arrest. Turns out, shouting bread loud enough can actually topple an empire. Who knew? The speed of it all was what was most shocking. We went from absolute monarchy to a de facto republic in the blink of an eye. There was no bloody civil war, no long, protracted struggle. The entire edifice of the autocracy proved to be a hollow, rotten shell. When the people pushed, it simply collapsed into dust. We, the nobility, who had built our entire world on the foundation of the throne, were left standing in the rubble, bewildered, and suddenly very, very vulnerable. The peasants had said "niet," and the world as we knew it had ceased to exist. This dizzying, head-spinning collapse from absolute power to absolute irrelevance is a story that defies belief. Yet, it happened. If you want to continue making sense of these rapids of history, to understand how a 300-year-old dynasty can vanish overnight, then you cannot afford to miss a single broadcast. Help us document this unprecedented historical whiplash. Subscribe to our channel now. Hit that notification bell with the force of a revolutionary mob tearing down an imperial eagle. You must subscribe because the fall is far from over, and the ground is still rushing up to meet us. After the Tsar, in a fit of uncharacteristic common sense, decided to sign his own redundancy notice, we were left with a most peculiar situation. The monarchy, that great 300-year-old oak tree, had been felled, leaving a rather large and inconvenient hole in the political landscape. Into this void stepped not one, but two new masters, each claiming to be the true voice of the revolution. It was as if we had traded a single, predictable autocrat for a two-headed hydra, with both heads utterly convinced of their own brilliance and utterly contemptuous of the other. The era of dual power had begun, and with it, a new chapter in our national tragicomedy. The first head of this beast was the provisional government. A more respectable, well-meaning and hopelessly out-of-touch collection of gentlemen you could not hope to find. It was composed largely of the liberal grandees from the old Duma, princes, professors, industrialists, men like myself, who believed in order, property, and the importance of a good tailor. Our first prime minister was Prince Lvov, a man so thoroughly decent and inoffensive that he was practically invisible. We saw ourselves as the steady hand on the tiller, the responsible adults who would guide Russia through this unfortunate revolutionary outburst and toward a sensible, Western-style democracy. We were, of course, completely deluded. The second head, slithering out from the revolutionary sewers, was the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. If the provisional government was a collection of well-bred borzois, the Soviet was a mangy pack of stray dogs. It was a chaotic, sprawling, and intensely odorous assembly of factory delegates and mutinous soldiers, all shouting at once and smoking the cheapest, foulest tobacco imaginable. They were socialists of every stripe and flavor, from the moderate Mensheviks to the more radical social revolutionaries. They held no official power, yet they controlled everything that mattered: the soldiers, the railways, the post and telegraph offices. They were the muscle of the revolution, and they knew it. And so began the farce of dual power. The two bodies set up shop in the same building, the magnificent Tauri de Palace, practically sharing corridors. One can only imagine the awkward encounters in the hallways. On one side you would have a well-dressed minister from the provisional government clutching a portfolio of important-sounding documents. On the other, a grimy soldier with a rifle slung over his shoulder and a half-eaten pickle in his hand, representing the might of the Soviet. Our new leaders, you see. They were like a pack of puppies fighting over a single, very stale bone. Endearing, if they weren't in charge of a nation crumbling around us. The provisional government would issue a decree and the Soviet would issue a competing one. We would call for national unity and a renewed war effort, and they would call for an end to the imperialist slaughter. We would speak of the sanctity of private property, and they would speak of seizing land for the peasants. It was a government by permanent argument. Nothing could be done without the approval of the Soviet, and the Soviet, by its very nature, could rarely agree on anything. The machinery of the state simply ground to a halt, choked by the endless bickering of its new masters. The most pressing issue, the one that had brought down the Tsar in the first place, was the war, and on this our new leaders were fatally divided. We in the provisional government, honor bound by our treaties with the Allies, insisted that Russia must continue to fight. To do otherwise would be a national disgrace, a betrayal of our commitments to France and Britain. Our foreign minister, a pompous historian named Milyukov, even dreamed of annexing Constantinople, a delusion of grandeur that was laughable even by our standards. We believed, foolishly, that a victorious end to the war would somehow legitimize our rule and restore order. The Soviet and the masses they represented had a rather different view. They were tired of the war. They were tired of the endless slaughter, the food shortages, the constant grief. They wanted peace, and they wanted it now. Not a glorious peace with territorial gains, but a simple, straightforward end to the killing. The soldiers at the front were already voting with their feet, deserting in droves to go home. The idea that we could somehow inspire these men to launch a new offensive against the Germans was a fantasy of the highest order. But we clung to it because it was the only policy we had. Then there was the land question. For centuries the Russian peasant had dreamed of one thing: owning the land he worked. The revolution, they believed, was the fulfillment of that dream. They expected the new government to seize the estates of the gentry, people like me, and distribute them among the villages. It was a simple, powerful demand. And our response? We prevaricated. We appointed committees. We promised that the issue would be decided by a future constituent assembly, to be convened at some unspecified date. We told the peasants to be patient, to respect the law, and to wait. Telling a Russian peasant to be patient is like telling a bear not to eat honey. It goes against its very nature. The peasants, seeing our inaction, decided to take matters into their own hands. All across the countryside they began to seize land, burn down manor houses, and redistribute livestock. It was a vast, chaotic, and often violent jacquerie. We in the government wrung our hands and issued proclamations condemning these illegal seizures, but we were powerless to stop them. We had lost control of the countryside, just as we had lost control of the army. The provisional government was in essence a phantom. It had all the outward trappings of power, the ministries, the official letterhead, the grand pronouncements, but it had no real authority. It was a government of ghosts haunting the corridors of a palace while the real power was being exercised in the streets, the barracks and the villages. We were attempting to conduct a symphony with a broken baton and an orchestra that refused to play. The result was not music, but a deafening, discordant noise. The disarray was comical. Ministers would resign in a huff, only to be replaced by other, equally ineffectual figures. The composition of the government changed so frequently it was difficult to keep track of who was in charge of what. The star of this chaotic show was a man named Alexander Kerensky. A lawyer and a fiery orator, He was the only person to be a member of both the provisional government and the Soviet. He saw himself as the bridge between the two, the man who could unite the nation. He was energetic, ambitious, and possessed of a truly astonishing self-regard. He loved to strike dramatic poses and deliver passionate speeches, but when it came to concrete action, he was utterly useless. Kerensky's great plan was to launch a new military offensive in the summer of 1917. The Kerensky Offensive, as it came to be known, was meant to be a glorious patriotic revival, a stunning victory that would rally the country around the provisional government. It was a catastrophic failure. The Russian soldiers, after a brief initial advance, simply refused to fight anymore. They held meetings, debated the orders, and then either retreated or fraternized with the enemy. The offensive collapsed, shattering what little credibility the army and the provisional government had left. The failure of the offensive triggered a new crisis in Petrograd, the July days. Enraged soldiers and radical workers, egged on by the more extreme Bolshevik faction, took to the streets calling for the overthrow of the provisional government and the transfer of all power to the Soviets. For a few chaotic days it seemed as if the government would fall, but the uprising was premature and the government, with the help of loyal troops, managed to suppress it. The Bolsheviks were blamed, their leaders arrested or forced into hiding. We breathed a sigh of relief. We thought we had crushed the radicals and saved the revolution from itself. But we had done nothing of the sort. We had merely papered over the cracks. The core issues, the war, the land, the food shortages, remained unsolved. Our inability to address these fundamental problems created a political vacuum. And it was into this vacuum that a new, far more ruthless force was beginning to move. We in the provisional government had inherited a crumbling empire, and in our fumbling, well-intentioned incompetence, we were doing nothing but accelerating its collapse. We were the undertakers of the old regime, busily preparing the corpse for a funeral we didn't even realize was happening. Our new leaders were not just fighting over a stale bone. They were rearranging the deck chairs on a sinking ship. They issued stirring declarations about freedom and democracy while the hull was being torn apart by the pressures of war and social collapse. They were men of words in a time that demanded action, men of compromise in a time that demanded radical solution. Their failure was not a failure of intent, it was a failure of imagination, a failure to grasp the sheer scale and fury of the forces they had unleashed. They were, in the end, just another chapter in Russia's long history of misrule, a brief, farcical interlude between the tragedy of the Tsar and the terror that was to come. If you find this political circus, this ballet of bureaucratic buffoonery as morbidly fascinating as I do, then you are in desperate need of our ongoing commentary. This is a farce of historical proportions, and you deserve a front-row seat. Smash that subscribe button with the force of a revolutionary decree. Activate all notifications so you don't miss a single misstep, a single faceplant by our esteemed new leaders. You must subscribe, because the main act of this political theater of the absurd is about to begin, and the clowns are sharpening their knives. In any civilized society, one requires certain staples to navigate the tedious business of existence: a decent tailor, a reliable mistress, and a well-stocked cellar. Here in Russia, as our civilization merrily swan dives into a cesspit of chaos, we have come to rely rather heavily on that third necessity. Indeed, if there is one thread that weaves itself through every layer of our unraveling social fabric, from the grandest palace to the filthiest trench, it is the clear, burning spirit of vodka. It is our national muse, our most trusted political advisor, and our only truly reliable painkiller. The only thing more plentiful than revolutionary pamphlets these days is vodka. It doesn't solve problems, but it makes them gloriously blurry. Highly recommended. The relationship between the Russian soul and the vodka bottle is a love story as old and as tragic as Russia itself. For the peasant, the muzhik, it has always been both solace and curse. It is the ritual that seals a bargain, the anesthetic for a brutal winter, the fuel for a wedding celebration, and the traditional accompaniment to a good fist fight. It is the liquid currency of the village, a way to forget the back-breaking toil, the crushing poverty, and the gnawing certainty that nothing will ever change. For generations, the state understood this. The government held a monopoly on vodka production, and the revenue it generated was a cornerstone of the imperial budget. We kept the peasants drunk, and they kept the treasury full. It was a cynical yet beautifully simple symbiosis. Then, at the outset of the Great War in 1914, the Tsar, in a moment of baffling moral clarity, decided to enact full prohibition. It was, on the surface, a noble gesture. He wanted a sober, focused, and industrious nation to face the German menace. He envisioned our brave soldiers marching to victory with clear eyes and steady hands. What he got instead was a nation suddenly deprived of its primary coping mechanism at the precise moment it needed it most. It was like taking away a man's crutch just as you push him off a cliff. The policy was a disaster of epic proportions, a testament to the Romanov talent for well-intentioned, catastrophic miscalculation. The immediate effect of prohibition was not sobriety but ingenuity. The Russian peasant, deprived of his state-sanctioned vodka, did what he has always done when faced with an inconvenient law: he ignored it. The art of illegal distilling, the creation of that foul, potent moonshine known as samagon, became a national pastime. Every village, every hut seemed to have its own primitive still bubbling away, turning potatoes, grain, beets, anything with a trace of sugar, into raw, throat-scorching alcohol. The state lost a third of its revenue, and the people got a much worse quality of drunk. It was a lose-lose situation of breathtaking stupidity. For us, the prohibition was a minor inconvenience. Our cellars were already stocked with the finest French cognacs, wines, and genuine pre-war Smirnov. But for the common man, the world became a desperate hunt for anything that could induce a state of oblivion. They drank denatured alcohol, wood polish, cologne, anything with a kick. The results were often tragic: blindness, poisoning, death. But such was the desperation that people were willing to risk it. When the choice is between a clear-eyed view of a world of starvation and slaughter and a blurry, potentially lethal chemical haze, the haze starts to look very appealing. As the war dragged on and the revolution began to bubble, alcohol took on a new, more dangerous role. It became the fuel for the chaos. A mutinous regiment, before storming its offices, would first raid the local liquor store. A mob, before burning down a police station, would fortify itself with stolen spirits. The revolution was not a sober affair. It was a vast, sprawling, drunken brawl. The air in Petrograd during those fateful days was thick with the smell of cheap alcohol and gunpowder, a truly noxious perfume for a dying era. With the collapse of the Tsar's authority, the last vestiges of control over alcohol vanished. The wine cellars of the grand palaces, including the Tsar's own vast collection at the Winter Palace, became targets for the revolutionary masses. These were not political acts, they were drunken rampages. We witnessed the so-called wine pogroms, where soldiers and sailors would break into a cellar not to steal a few bottles, a crime I could almost respect, but to smash everything in sight, unleashing rivers of priceless claret and champagne into the gutters. They would lie on the ground, lapping it up from the filth, until they passed out in a stupor. It was a perfect metaphor for the revolution itself, the senseless destruction of priceless things by a population that had lost its head. The provisional government, in its infinite wisdom, tried to combat this. They sent out special detachments to guard the cellars, or, failing that, to destroy the stocks before the mob could get to them. Fire brigades were dispatched to the Winter Palace to literally pump the wine out of the cellars and into the Neva River. The crowd that gathered to watch this spectacle was a sight to behold. They groaned in collective agony as this river of Burgundy flowed into the icy water. Some tried to drink from the hoses. It was a scene of such grotesque, tragicomic absurdity that it could only have happened in Russia. Alcohol became the great equalizer. In my own circle, the drinking became more frantic, more desperate. We no longer drank to celebrate, but to forget the news from the front, to forget the rumblings from the streets, to forget the gnawing fear that our world was ending. The clinking of our crystal glasses became a kind of frantic defiance, a way of pretending that everything was normal while the house was burning down around us. The difference between our refined self-medication and the peasant's brutish oblivion was merely one of aesthetics, not of intent. We were all seeking the same escape. The peasant's perspective on vodka has always been one of profound ambivalence. It is the little water, the bringer of warmth and temporary joy, the thief that steals the brain. They know it is a poison that drains their wages, ruins their health, and invites violence into their homes. Yet it is also a sacred part of their culture, an essential lubricant for a life of unbearable hardship. It is a demon they have learned to live with, and in many cases, to embrace. The revolution did not change this, it merely amplified it, turning a chronic condition into an acute, life-threatening fever. The role of alcohol in the army's collapse cannot be overstated. A sober army might have held the line. A drunk army, however, is an army of philosophers. Give a Russian soldier a rifle and he will fight. Give him a bottle of Samagon and he will form a committee to debate the geopolitical implications of the battle. The trenches were awash with illegal spirits, which did more to destroy military discipline than any German machine gun. Officers who tried to enforce sobriety were often the first to be shot when their regiment mutinied. This widespread intoxication created a surreal atmosphere. Political commissars would arrive at the front to deliver fiery speeches about international socialism, only to find their intended audience too drunk to stand. Agitators would hand out pamphlets that were immediately used as bottle stoppers. The grand ideological struggle for the soul of Russia was often postponed due to a collective, debilitating hangover. It was difficult to build a new world when half the builders were seeing double. Even the new leaders were not immune. While some, like the famously abstemious Lenin, saw drunkenness as a symptom of bourgeois decay, many others were happy to partake. The halls of the Smolny Institute, the Bolshevik headquarters, often reeked of stale liquor and revolutionary fervor. Deals were made, orders were given, and fates were sealed, under the influence of the very substance that was helping to dissolve the old world. The irony was lost on them, as irony so often is on the truly committed. In the end, vodka was more than just a drink. It was a character in our national drama, a trickster spirit that whispered in everyone's ear. It offered a fleeting moment of camaraderie in a trench, a burst of courage to a rioter, a moment of blissful numbness to a nobleman watching his estate burn on the horizon. It was the answer to every question, the solution to every problem, which is to say, it was no solution at all. It was merely a way to blur the edges of a reality that had become too sharp, too painful to bear. As I broadcast this now, a glass of my finest Georgian brandy sits before me. It is a small act of defiance, a toast to a world of elegance and order that no longer exists. Outside I can hear the sounds of a very different kind of drinking, the raw, desperate sound of a city coming undone. We are a nation adrift, and we have cast our lot with the bottle as our guide. It is a foolish, suicidal navigator, but it is the only one we have left, and in the glorious blur it provides, for a fleeting moment one can almost believe we are not sinking. If this exploration of our national coping mechanism has struck a chord, if you appreciate a good story steeped in vodka and despair, then you know what you must do. Our supply of stories, unlike our supply of liquor, is not yet exhausted. Do not let our shared history go unappreciated. Hit that subscribe button with the unsteady yet firm resolve of a man pouring his last glass. Ring the notification bell, for it tolls for a world drowning in sorrow and spirits. We must subscribe to bear witness to the end, one drink at a time. There was a time, not so long ago, when the possession of a firearm was a mark of distinction. It was the right of a gentleman to own a fine pair of dueling pistols or a beautifully crafted English shotgun for hunting. The state, in its wisdom, held the monopoly on serious violence. The army had its rifles, the police had their revolvers, and the rest of society had to make do with fists and harsh language. It was a tidy, orderly arrangement. Now, however, that order has completely evaporated, replaced by a new and terrifying egalitarianism. Everyone has a gun now. The peasants, the factory workers, even the grumpy old babushka down the street who used to menace children with a broomstick. She now wields a nugget revolver with surprising authority. It's like a very violent, very unorganized party, with more accidental shootings. This sudden and alarming democratization of firepower is a direct consequence of the Great War. For 3 years, we had been arming millions of our peasants, taking them from their plows, handing them a Mosinangant rifle, and pointing them in the general direction of Germany. We created the largest army in human history. What we failed to consider, in our rush to feed the meat grinder of the Eastern Front, was what would happen when those peasants decided they no longer wished to be soldiers. And in 1917, that is precisely what happened. They began to desert by the tens of thousands and then by the hundreds of thousands. And they didn't come home empty-handed. They brought their rifles with them. Each deserting soldier, trudging back to his village with his government-issue rifle and a pocket full of ammunition, became a new, independent power center. He was no longer just Ivan the farmer. He was Ivan the farmer with a tool capable of killing at 500 paces. This had a profound effect on the traditional dynamics of the countryside. Landlords, estate managers, and local officials, who had once been figures of absolute authority, suddenly found themselves negotiating with men who held the means of their own immediate demise. The age-old balance of power between the landowner with his whip and the peasant with his cap was irrevocably altered by the introduction of a 7.62mm cartridge. In the cities, a similar phenomenon was occurring, though with a more organized ideological bent. The factory workers, who had been the engine of the February Revolution, were not content to leave the business of violence to others. They formed their own militias, the so-called Red Guards. They drilled in factory yards, often under the tutelage of radicalized soldiers. Their arms came from various sources: rifles stolen from police stations, weapons pilfered from military transports, and, most spectacularly, from the storming of the Petrograd arsenal, which flung thousands of firearms into the eager hands of the proletariat. A man who once operated a lathe was now operating a machine gun. It was a remarkable, if terrifying, career change. The provisional government, of course, was utterly powerless to stop this. They would issue stern proclamations forbidding the unauthorized possession of firearms, which were universally ignored. How could they possibly disarm a population when their own authority barely extended beyond the front steps of the Winter Palace? Their own soldiers were either joining the armed masses or selling their weapons to them for a bottle of vodka. The state had lost its monopoly on violence. And like a spilled bottle of ink, that violence was now spreading, staining every corner of our society. This proliferation of guns turned everyday disputes into potentially lethal confrontations. A disagreement over the price of potatoes in the market, which once might have ended in a shouting match, could now escalate into a gunfight. A drunken argument in a tavern could result in multiple fatalities. The background noise of the city, once a sporadic crack of rifle fire, was now punctuated by the sporadic crack of rifle fire. One learned to distinguish between the different sounds: the sharp report of a pistol, the heavier boom of a service rifle, the terrifying chatter of a Maxim gun. It was a new and deeply unsettling urban symphony. The lawlessness was breathtaking. Armed bands roamed the countryside, calling themselves revolutionaries, anarchists, or simply bandits, depending on their mood. They would descend on isolated estates, looting, burning, and killing. My cousin Dmitri had his manor house in the Tambov province overrun by a group of deserters who called themselves the People's Vengeance Committee. They drank his wine, wore his clothes, and held a mock trial before executing his prize-winning bull for counter-revolutionary gluttony. Dmitri, thankfully, had the good sense to be in Petrograd at the time. The bull was not so fortunate. This new reality forced everyone to adapt. For us, it meant turning our homes into fortified compounds. We barred the windows, locked the gates, and hired our own private armies, usually composed of former soldiers or Circassian mercenaries who were loyal to the highest bidder. My own front door is now guarded by two rather large men with shotguns, who used to be sergeants in the Preobrazhensky regiment. They are terribly expensive, but they are worth every worthless ruble. An evening at home has acquired the thrilling ambiance of a siege. The common citizen, who could not afford private guards, had to rely on his own resources. City dwellers armed themselves for protection against burglars and street toughs. In the villages, peasants formed their own self-defense units to protect their grain from roaming gangs and government requisitioning parties. It was a war of all against all, a Hobbesian nightmare come to life on the vast Russian plain. The only law was the law of the loaded chamber. The sheer incompetence with which these new gun owners handled their weapons was almost as dangerous as their intent. Stories abound of peasants trying to use rifle butts to hammer nails, of Red Guards accidentally shooting their own comrades during political rallies, of children finding loaded pistols and using them as toys. The concept of firearm safety was completely alien. A gun was a tool, like an axe or a spade, to be used and then left leaning in a corner. The casualty rate from sheer carelessness was, I imagine, quite staggering. This armed chaos created a climate of pervasive fear. One never knew who might have a gun or for what reason they might decide to use it. A simple carriage ride across town became a perilous journey. The frayed nerves of the populace, already stretched to the breaking point by war and hunger, were now subjected to the constant, low-grade terror of random violence. It was exhausting. It made one long for the simple, predictable tyranny of the old regime. At least then you knew who was likely to shoot you and why. The political factions, of course, exploited this situation for their own ends. The Bolsheviks in particular were masters at organizing and directing the armed masses. While other parties were still talking about parliamentary procedure, the Bolsheviks were drilling their Red Guards and establishing weapons caches. They understood in a way that the well-meaning fools of the provisional government never could, that in a revolution, political power does not come from a ballot box, it grows out of the barrel of a gun. The tragic irony is that this flood of weapons did nothing to make the common person safer. It was a classic case of an arms race, where each individual's attempt to secure his own safety only contributed to the insecurity of the whole. When your neighbor has a rifle, you need a rifle. When he gets a machine gun, you need a machine gun. It is a logic that leads only to a landscape of fortified homes and trigger-happy citizens, a place where trust is a fatal liability. So here we are, a nation of 15 million soldiers, most of whom no longer have an army, and countless armed civilians, all with grievances, all with access to lethal force. It is the ultimate expression of the failure of the state. The government, having armed its people for a foreign war, now finds itself facing those same people, armed and angry, in its own backyard. The guns we sent to fight the Germans are now being used to settle old scores, to seize property, and to decide the future of Russia, one bullet at a time. It is a grim, chaotic, and deafeningly loud state of affairs. If you are still listening to this broadcast and have not yet been forced to take cover from a stray bullet, then you are clearly a person of discerning taste and remarkable luck. This symphony of gunfire and social collapse is the soundtrack of our times, and we are here to provide the program notes. Don't let the chaos drown us out. Subscribe to our channel. Hit that button with the decisive click of a rifle bolt sliding into place. Activate all notifications so you don't miss a single dispatch from the front lines of our societal disintegration. You must subscribe before the only signal left is the muzzle flash in the dark. Just when one thought the political stage in Petrograd could not possibly accommodate any more lunatics, a new and altogether more potent strain of madness arrived by train. While we were all preoccupied with the farcical double act of the provisional government and the Soviet, a character who had been a footnote in the revolutionary gossip columns for years decided to make a dramatic entrance. He came from exile in Switzerland, transported across Germany in a sealed train like some sort of political bacillus, a plague germ that the Germans, in a moment of cynical genius, decided to unleash upon us. And so, in April of 1917, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as Lenin, arrived at the Finland station. His arrival was a spectacle of the highest absurdity. The leaders of the Petrograd Soviet, those moderate socialists who were still clinging to the idea of a respectable revolution, had turned out to greet him. They brought him a bouquet of flowers, which looked utterly ridiculous in his hands. The head of the Soviet, a dull fellow named Chkidze, gave a welcoming speech full of tedious platitudes about uniting the forces of democracy. He expected Lenin to play along, to join their little club of well-meaning debaters. He had clearly not been reading Lenin's work. Lenin, ignoring the flowers and the welcome party, turned instead to the crowd of workers and soldiers who had gathered and proceeded to call for the immediate overthrow of the very government that had just welcomed him. It was a spectacular breach of etiquette. And then Lenin arrived, looked like a disgruntled professor, all bald head, beady eyes, and a rather shabby suit. He talked like a prophet of doom, with a grating guttural voice that seemed to hammer his words into the air. He climbed atop an armored car, a terribly vulgar platform, but effective, I suppose, and laid out a vision so radical, so utterly divorced from the moderate bourgeois revolution we thought we were having, that it left most people speechless. There was no talk of unity or patience. He called for an immediate end to the imperialist war, the seizure of all land by the peasants, the nationalization of the banks, and, most alarmingly, the transfer of all power to the Soviets. It was a declaration of war against everything the provisional government, and indeed men like myself, stood for. His program, which he called his April Theses, was initially met with disbelief, even among his own Bolshevik followers. They thought he had lost his mind in exile, that he was out of touch with the situation on the ground. The other socialist parties openly ridiculed him. They called him an anarchist, a madman, a German agent sent to sow discord. And they were not wrong about that last part. The Germans had indeed facilitated his return, hoping he would disrupt Russia's war effort. It was, perhaps, the most successful act of sabotage in military history. They had sent us not a bomb, but an idea, and it was about to prove far more explosive. The genius of Lenin, if one can use that word for such a destructive force, was his understanding of the popular mood. While the other politicians were giving long, complicated speeches about constitutional assemblies and treaty obligations, Lenin offered the masses something they could actually understand. He boiled down his entire radical program into 3 simple, powerful words: peace, land, and bread. It was a slogan of pure, brutal simplicity. It addressed the 3 deepest desires of the Russian people. It was a promise that cut through all the political noise and spoke directly to their suffering. To the soldiers in the trenches, sick of dying for a cause they no longer understood, he offered peace. Not a negotiated peace, not a peace with honor, but an immediate, unconditional end to the slaughter. To the peasants in the villages, who had dreamed of owning their own patch of earth for centuries, he offered land, not a promise of future reform, but the immediate, revolutionary seizure of the gentry's estates. And to the starving workers in the cities, shivering in bread lines, he offered bread. He promised to end the shortages, to feed the hungry, to take control of the food supply and distribute it to the people. It was a trifecta of political seduction. We, in our refined circles, laughed at the crudeness of it all. It was the politics of the nursery, offering sweets to screaming children. We underestimated its power. We failed to grasp that when you are starving, when your son has been killed at the front, when you have spent your life in servitude, you are not interested in the finer points of parliamentary procedure. You are interested in peace, land, and bread. Lenin understood this. The provisional government, with its endless talk of duty and patience, did not. His other great slogan was, "All power to the Soviets." This, too, was a stroke of cunning brilliance. It appealed to the growing sense among the workers and soldiers that the Soviets were their true representatives, not the unelected bourgeois politicians of the provisional government. It also served to expose the hypocrisy of the other socialist parties, the Mensheviks and the SRs, who controlled the Soviet but refused to take power themselves, preferring to prop up the failing provisional government. Lenin was calling their bluff, daring them to take the power that was supposedly theirs for the asking. Slowly but surely, the Bolsheviks' popularity began to grow. They had been a marginal, extremist faction, but their radical message began to resonate with the increasingly disillusioned populace. The soldiers, returning from the disastrous Kerensky offensive, were no longer listening to the patriotic speeches of the provisional government. They were listening to the Bolshevik agitators who told them the war was a crime. The workers, facing factory lockouts and spiraling inflation, were listening to the Bolsheviks who promised them control of the means of production. The peasants, tired of waiting for the land they had been promised, were listening to the Bolsheviks who told them to simply take it. The Bolsheviks were organized, disciplined, and utterly ruthless. While other parties were debating, they were acting. They built up their network of party cells in factories and military barracks. They published newspapers like Pravda that relentlessly attacked the provisional government and promoted their own simple, powerful message: They built up their own private army, the Red Guards. They were preparing for a seizure of power, and they were not making a secret of it. The provisional government, meanwhile, continued its dithering. They seemed incapable of understanding the nature of the threat that Lenin represented. They treated him as just another political opponent, a noisy extremist who could be controlled through debate and legal maneuvering. After the failed uprising in the July days, they arrested some of his followers and forced him into hiding, but they failed to crush the party. Kerensky, in his vanity, seemed to believe he could outmaneuver Lenin, that he could win over the masses with his own soaring oratory. He was bringing a silver tongue to a gunfight. Lenin's return fundamentally changed the character of the revolution. Before his arrival, it was a chaotic, spontaneous, and largely directionless affair. He gave it a brain and a backbone. He provided a clear, uncompromising program and a disciplined organization to carry it out. He transformed the shapeless discontent of the masses into a focused political weapon. He was the catalyst that would turn the watery soup of the February Revolution into the thick, bloody borscht of October. We watched all this with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. It was like watching a master arsonist explain in meticulous detail how he was going to burn down your house while the fire brigade stands by, arguing about the proper nozzle to use on the hose. The sheer audacity of the man was breathtaking. He had no respect for tradition, for property, for law, for God. He saw the world as a simple struggle between classes, and he was utterly convinced that he was leading the right side to an inevitable, violent victory. And surprisingly, people listened. The tired, the hungry, the desperate, the disillusioned. They listened. They saw in this grim, determined little man a reflection of their own rage, a promise of vengeance against a world that had given them nothing but suffering. He was their prophet, their champion, their avenging angel. To us, he was the devil incarnate, the embodiment of everything we feared, the tyranny of the mob, the destruction of culture, the end of Russia as we knew it. Alarming, really, to see how quickly a nation can fall in love with its own executioner. If you are captivated by the arrival of this ultimate agitator, if you want to understand how a single, determined man with a few simple slogans could hijack a revolution, then you must continue to follow our dispatches. The drama is escalating and the main characters are all now on stage. Support our ongoing revolutionary observations. Subscribe to our channel now. Hit that notification bell with the urgency of a German saboteur setting a timer. You must subscribe, because the train has arrived at the station, and the passenger it carried is about to set the world on fire. The summer of 1917 was a season of profound political schizophrenia. The initial, almost cheerful chaos of the February Revolution had curdled into a sullen, feverish discontent. The provisional government, that collection of well-intentioned amateurs, was still issuing pronouncements, but no one was listening. The queues for bread were longer than ever, the army was disintegrating, and the peasants were busy burning down our country estate. Into this vacuum of authority, the Bolsheviks, with their brutishly simple slogans and their promises of a proletarian paradise, were gaining ground at a terrifying pace. The masses were becoming more radical by the day, and our summer was spent watching a series of increasingly desperate and farcical attempts to restore an order that was already dead. The first act of this summer farce came in early July. The July days, as they were rather dramatically called, were a messy, spontaneous, and ultimately doomed uprising. It was sparked by the disastrous failure of the Kerensky offensive and the general misery of the Petrograd garrison, who were being ordered to the front and had no intention of going. Tens of thousands of soldiers, sailors, from the Kronstadt naval base, a particularly nasty nest of anarchists, and factory workers poured into the streets, armed to the teeth and roaring for the overthrow of the provisional government. They marched to the Tauride Palace, demanding that the Soviet take power. It was the revolution's angry, drunken second act. The Bolsheviks were caught off guard. They had been stoking the fires of discontent for months, of course, but even they felt this uprising was premature. Lenin, ever the cautious tactician, knew they weren't quite ready to seize power. However, one cannot lead a revolution from behind, so they reluctantly placed themselves at the head of the movement, trying to give it some semblance of direction. For 2 days, the city was in turmoil. There was sporadic gunfire, looting, and a great deal of angry shouting. It seemed for a moment that the provisional government might actually be swept away by this tide of armed rabble. But the uprising fizzled out. It lacked clear leadership and a coherent plan. The leaders of the Soviet, the Mensheviks and SRs, once again refused to take power, leaving the mob raging impotently outside their windows. The provisional government, summoning what little authority it had left, called in loyal troops from the front to restore order. The crowds were dispersed, the sailors sent back to their island fortress, and the brief, bloody rebellion was over. It was a failure, but a failure that had profound consequences. The government, emboldened by its victory, immediately cracked down on the Bolsheviks. Pravda was shut down, warrants were issued for the arrest of their leaders, and Lenin, with his trademark knack for self-preservation, shaved off his beard and fled to Finland in disguise. Trotsky and other prominent Bolsheviks were arrested and imprisoned. We, in the respectable circles, breathed a collective sigh of relief. The extremists had overplayed their hand, we thought. The Bolshevik menace had been contained. Kerensky, now promoted to prime minister, was hailed as the savior of the nation. It was a moment of supreme and tragically short-lived optimism. This crackdown, however, was a cosmetic solution to a much deeper problem. Jailing a few leaders did nothing to solve the underlying issues of war, land, and hunger. In fact, it turned the Bolsheviks into martyrs, victims of a counter-revolutionary government. Their message, far from being silenced, gained a new allure among the increasingly radicalized masses. The government had won the Battle of the July days, but in doing so, it had lost even more of its popular support. It was seen as an oppressor, a government that would turn guns on its own people to protect the interests of the bourgeoisie and continue an unpopular war. And then came the second, and far more ludicrous, act of our summer drama, the Kornilov affair. It's a story of such breathtaking incompetence and paranoia that it would be hilarious if it weren't the nail in the coffin of Russian democracy. Alexander Kerensky, our vain and theatrical prime minister, had appointed a new commander-in-chief of the army, a General Lav Kornilov. Kornilov was a tough, no-nonsense soldier with the politics of a medieval warlord. He despised the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, and the general lack of discipline that had infected his army. He was, in short, a man who believed that what Russia needed was a good, stiff dose of military dictatorship. Kerensky and Kornilov initially seemed to be allies. They both wanted to restore order and crush the radicals. They entered into a series of confused back-channel negotiations about bringing troops to Petrograd to suppress any future Bolshevik uprisings and to discipline the city's unruly garrison. But this is where the farce began. Through a series of miscommunications, amplified by the meddling of a particularly inept Go-Midler, Kerensky became convinced that Kornilov was not planning to save him, but to overthrow him and establish his own military junta. Panicked and terrified of a right-wing coup, Kerensky did something utterly insane. On the 27th of August, he publicly denounced his own commander-in-chief as a traitor and a counter-revolutionary. Kornilov, who believed he was acting on the prime minister's orders, was stunned. Feeling betrayed, he decided that Kerensky was a weakling under the thumb of the radicals and that he had no choice but to march on Petrograd and save Russia from them both. The Kornilov affair had begun. It was a head-on collision between two men, both of whom thought they were the nation's savior. Kerensky was now in an impossible position. He had declared war on the only man who had loyal troops at his command. To whom could he turn for protection against the approaching counter-revolution? In a move of staggering, suicidal desperation, he turned to the very people he had just thrown in prison, the Bolsheviks. He appealed to the workers and sailors to defend the revolution against Kornilov's savage division. It was a plea that would seal his and our fate. The Bolsheviks could not believe their luck. Here was the head of the government that had just branded them traitors, now begging for their help. They agreed, but on their own terms. Their leaders, including Trotsky, were to be released from prison. Their Red Guard militias were to be officially armed by the provisional government itself to help defend the capital. Kerensky, seeing no other option, agreed. He handed thousands of rifles directly into the hands of his own mortal enemies. It was like a man fearing a wolf inviting a tiger into his house for protection. The defense of Petrograd was a masterclass in Bolshevik organization. They mobilized the railway workers, who tore up tracks and diverted Kornilov's trains. They sent agitators to talk to his soldiers, many of whom were Muslims from the Caucasus, convincing them that they were being used as pawns in a counter-revolutionary plot. Kornilov's army, faced with this combination of logistical sabotage and revolutionary propaganda, simply melted away without a single shot being fired in anger. The great coup collapsed before it even began. Kornilov was arrested and the affair was over. The Bolsheviks emerged as the undisputed heroes of the hour. They were seen as the saviors of the revolution, the only ones with the courage and organization to stand up to the threat of a military dictatorship. Their leaders were released from prison not as pardoned criminals, but as triumphant heroes. The very weapons that Kerensky had given them to fight Kornilov were now kept, forming a formidable and well-armed proletarian army. In a matter of weeks, they had gone from a persecuted semi-legal fringe group to the most powerful and trusted political force in the capital. Kerensky, on the other hand, was destroyed. He had lost all credibility with the right, who saw him as a traitor who had betrayed Kornilov. He had lost all credibility with the left, who saw him as a panicky bungler who had to rely on the Bolsheviks to save his own skin. He was a leader with no followers, a general with no army. The provisional government was now a hollow shell, a ghost floating in the corridors of the Winter Palace, with no power, no authority, and no future. It's like a bad play. Everyone's shouting, no one's listening, and the main characters keep getting arrested, then released. Very dramatic, very inefficient. The summer of discontent had reached its inevitable conclusion. Through a series of blunders, miscalculations, and acts of sheer political idiocy, the moderate forces had managed to discredit themselves completely, while simultaneously arming and empowering their most radical opponents. The path to a Bolshevik seizure of power, which had seemed a distant possibility in July, now looked like an open road. Lenin, watching from his hiding place in Finland, must have been rubbing his hands with glee. His enemies were doing his work for him. The stage was now set for the final act. If you are perversely entertained by this cascading series of political blunders, if the spectacle of a government engineering its own demise holds a certain fascination for you, then you are one of us. Our chronicle of this national farce is not yet complete. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you have a front row seat for the grand finale. Hit that notification bell with the force of a general launching a poorly planned coup. You must subscribe because the tragicomedy is almost over and the curtain is about to rise on a true reign of terror. After the farcical tragicomedy of the Kornilov affair, a strange and deceptive quiet fell over Petrograd. Kerensky, our Prime Minister-in-Chief, was still occupying the Tsar's apartments in the Winter Palace, presumably practicing his dramatic poses in front of the mirror. But he was a ghost haunting a mausoleum, a leader with no one left to lead. The real power now lay with the Bolsheviks. They had won a majority in the Petrograd Soviet, and their man, Leon Trotsky, that insufferably arrogant intellectual with the pince-nez, was its chairman. From their headquarters at the Smolny Institute, a former finishing school for noble girls, oh, the irony. They were methodically planning the final act. We all knew something was coming. The air was thick with it. But when it finally happened, it was not the epic, bloody apocalypse we had been anticipating. It was something far more Russian, an unstated, almost bureaucratic coup wrapped in the language of a proletarian crusade. The Bolsheviks didn't bother with grand declarations of war. That was not their style. Instead, they created something called the Military Revolutionary Committee, a rather bland-sounding organization, with the utterly terrifying purpose of organizing the defense of the revolution. In reality, it was the general staff for the insurrection. Under Trotsky's direction, they began to systematically co-opt the Petrograd garrison, sending their commissars to every barracks, securing the loyalty, or at least the passive neutrality, of the regiments. They were not asking for heroic sacrifice. They were simply asking the soldiers to obey their orders instead of Kerensky's. In most cases, the soldiers, who had no desire to fight anyone, happily obliged. The takeover itself, which began on the night of the 24th of October, was a masterpiece of quiet efficiency. There were no heroic charges, no barricades in the streets, no grand battles for the soul of the city. The Bolsheviks, in small disciplined squads of Red Guards and sailors, simply walked to the key strategic points of the capital and took them over. The telephone exchange, the post office, the railway stations, the state bank, All fell without a single shot being fired. The operators at the telephone exchange were simply told that a new authority was in charge and that all calls from the provisional government were to be ignored. It was a revolution by administrative decree. While all this was happening, the city itself remained bizarrely normal. The trams were still running, the shops were open, the theaters were preparing for their evening performances. People went about their business grumbling about the price of potatoes, largely unaware that a fundamental transfer of power was occurring right under their noses. One could have been sipping coffee on the Nevsky Prospect and been completely oblivious to the fact that a socialist revolution was in progress a few blocks away. It was all terribly low-key, almost disappointingly so. One expects a bit more drama when one's world is ending. Kerensky, finally awakening from his stupor, found himself completely isolated. He tried to telephone for loyal troops, only to find the lines were dead. He sent frantic messages to the front, but they went unanswered. His authority had evaporated overnight. In a final, pathetic act, he managed to procure an automobile from the American embassy. He couldn't even find a loyal Russian car, and fled the city, hoping to rally support from the army. It was not a majestic departure. He was a fugitive, escaping from his own capital, leaving his ministers behind to face the music. A rather shabby end for a man who saw himself as Russia's Napoleon. That left only one bastion of the old government, the Winter Palace itself. There, the remaining ministers of the provisional government huddled together in a dining room, holding a pointless, rambling meeting, waiting for a doom they knew was inevitable. The palace, that vast and opulent symbol of Romanov power, was now their gilded cage. They were defended by a motley and frankly pathetic collection of troops, a few squadrons of Cossacks who were busy getting drunk, a company of cadets from the military academy, boys really, and in a final, absurd flourish, a women's battalion. The Amazons, as we call them, were meant to be a great patriotic symbol. In reality, they were the last, trembling line of defense for a dying government. The so-called storming of the Winter Palace, the event that the Bolsheviks would later mythologize as the heroic climax of the revolution, was anything but. For most of the day, nothing happened. The Red Guards and sailors surrounded the palace, but they seemed unsure of what to do next. They would occasionally fire a few pot shots at the walls, which would be answered by a feeble volley from within. It was less a battle and more a bad-tempered standoff. The storming of the Winter Palace, more like a polite stroll. Apparently there were more tourists than armed guards. Very Russian, understated chaos. The signal for the main assault was supposed to be a blank shot fired from the cruiser Aurora, which was moored in the Neva River. The Aurora did indeed fire a shot, but it only managed to do so hours late, and it rattled the windows of the palace more than its defenders. The great assault itself was a similar anticlimax. The Bolshevik forces discovered that large parts of the palace had been left unlocked and unguarded. They simply walked in through side entrances, wandered through the labyrinthine corridors, and eventually stumbled upon the room where the ministers were gathered. There was more danger of getting lost in the palace's 1,000 rooms than of getting shot. One of the first groups to enter the palace got sidetracked when they discovered the Tsar's magnificent wine cellar. The defense of the revolution was immediately postponed in favor of a massive impromptu drinking party. The women's battalion, seeing the hopelessness of their situation and the drunken state of their fellow defenders, surrendered with a great deal of weeping and hysterics. The cadets put up a brief resistance and then gave up. The Cossacks had long since slipped away. The battle for the Winter Palace was lost not to superior force, but to apathy, alcohol, and unlocked doors. The arrest of the provisional government was a scene of pure bureaucratic absurdity. A small, rather polite man named Antonov Yasinyako, a Bolshevik commissar, walked into the dining room where the ministers were still sitting around their table. "I inform you, members of the provisional government, that you are under arrest," he announced, as if serving a summons for a minor infraction. The ministers, weary and resigned, meekly submitted. They were then marched out and imprisoned in the Peter and Paul fortress, the very place where generations of revolutionaries had been incarcerated by the Tsars. The circle was now complete. The total number of casualties in this great historic seizure of power was negligible. Perhaps 5 or 6 people were killed, most of them by stray bullets. More people died from alcohol poisoning after looting the palace cellars than died in the actual storming. The October Revolution, this event that would shake the world, was in its execution a quiet, almost bloodless affair. It was a military operation, a coup d'état, carried out with ruthless precision by a small, determined minority against a government that had already ceased to exist in any meaningful way. That same night, as the final act of this drama was playing out, the Second Congress of Soviets was in session at the Smolny Institute. The moderate socialists, the Mensheviks and SRs were still talking, still protesting, still calling for a government of all democratic parties. When news arrived that the Bolsheviks had arrested the provisional government, the moderates were horrified. They denounced the coup as a crime against the revolution, and in a final, futile gesture, they walked out of the Congress in protest. It was the moment Trotsky had been waiting for. As they were leaving, he climbed the rostrum and hurled one of the most famous insults in political history after them. "You are pitiful, isolated individuals," he roared. "You are bankrupts. Your role is played out. Go where you belong from now on, into the dustbin of history." By walking out, the moderates had handed the Bolsheviks a gift. They were left with a clear majority in the Congress, which they could now use to legitimize their seizure of power. They had the stage all to themselves. Later that night, Lenin, who had been in hiding for most of the day, finally emerged. He walked onto the stage at Smolny to a thunderous, rapturous ovation from the assembled delegates. His first words were simple and direct. "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order," he declared. There was no triumphalism, no soaring rhetoric. It was the flat, declarative statement of an architect outlining his plans. And with that, the old world ended, and a new, terrifying one began. The coup was complete. The Bolshevik were in power, and we, the silent, horrified audience to this drama, could only pour another drink and wonder what fresh hell the morning would bring. This quiet, almost pedestrian end to the provisional government is a tale of anticlimax and absurdity, a fitting end to a farcical chapter. If you want to keep receiving these dispatches from a world turned upside down, if the chaotic, understated history of our fall continues to fascinate you, then you know the drill. This history needs its chroniclers, and you need the full story. Do us the courtesy of liking this broadcast, and more importantly, subscribing to the channel. The revolution may have been quiet, but our analysis of it will not be. Subscribe now before the new masters decide to shut us down for good. The morning after the Bolsheviks' little administrative reshuffle, we awoke to a new Russia. It was a strange, unsettling dawn. The trams were still running, but the newspapers on the street corners were all different. The old familiar titles had been replaced by screaming headlines from Pravda and Izvestia, proclaiming the dawn of a new age. Decrees signed by this Ulyanov-Lenin fellow were being plastered on every wall. A decree on peace, calling for an immediate end to the war. A decree on land, abolishing private ownership of estates like mine without compensation. It was all very efficient, very tidy, and utterly terrifying. They were dismantling our entire world on paper before they started doing it in person. So, the new boss is named Lenin, and his friends are very enthusiastic about re-educating anyone who disagrees. Their first order of business, after promising peace and handing our land over to the peasants, a gesture I'm sure they won't come to regret, was to create a new organ of state security. It had a long, tedious, and thoroughly bureaucratic name, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. We, in our fondness for morbid brevity, simply came to call it the Cheka. It was, in essence, the Tsar's old secret police, the Okhrana, but with less finesse and a much larger appetite for blood. The Cheka was placed under the command of a man named Felix Dzerzhinsky, a Polish fanatic with the cold, lifeless eyes of a taxidermist. He was a man utterly convinced of his own righteousness, a true believer who saw counter-revolutionaries and bourgeois saboteurs lurking in every shadow. His new organization was given sweeping powers to investigate, arrest, and, most chillingly, execute anyone deemed an enemy of the new state. There was no need for trials, for evidence, for pesky legal procedures. The Cheka was the sword and shield of the revolution, and its justice was swift, arbitrary, and final. At first, we thought it was a bluff, another piece of revolutionary theatre. We were accustomed to a certain inefficiency from our governments. We assumed this Cheka would be bogged down in paperwork and incompetence, like every ministry before it. We were wrong. The Cheka was terrifyingly efficient. Its agents, often drawn from the most ruthless elements of the party, began to operate with a brutal zeal. People began to disappear. A quiet knock on the door in the middle of the night became the most feared sound in Petrograd. A casual, critical remark made to a neighbor could result in a visit from Dzierżyński's men. The establishment of this new secret police was followed by the systematic dismantling of any and all opposition. The so-called bourgeois newspapers were shut down. Rival political parties, from the cadets to our erstwhile socialist colleagues, the Mensheviks and SRs, were declared counter-revolutionary and outlawed. The Bolsheviks had promised all power to the Soviets, but it quickly became clear that what they meant was all power to the Bolshevik Party. Any Soviet that dared to elect a non-Bolshevik majority was simply disbanded. The brief, chaotic flourishing of democracy that had followed the February Revolution was being systematically strangled in its cradle. The ultimate test of their commitment to democracy came in January of 1918, with the convening of the Constituent Assembly. This was the body that liberals and moderate socialists had been dreaming of for months, a freely elected parliament that would finally decide the future of Russia. The elections, which the Bolsheviks allowed to proceed, were a disaster for them. They won less than a quarter of the seats. The majority went to the socialist revolutionaries, the party of the peasants. Lenin was faced with a choice: accept the democratic will of the people or dispense with democracy altogether. He did not hesitate. The Constituent Assembly was allowed to meet for a single day. The delegates talked, they debated, they passed a few resolutions. It was all very parliamentary, all very civilized. The next morning, when they returned to the Tory Palace, they found the doors locked and barred, guarded by Red Guards who informed them that the assembly had been dissolved. Lenin declared that the Guard was tired. Just like that, Russia's first and only truly democratic parliament was dismissed. The message was clear: the only will that mattered was the will of the Bolshevik Party. This act, more than any other, signaled the true nature of the new regime. It was a dictatorship, pure and simple, and like all dictatorships, it would be maintained not by consent but by fear. This fear was soon given a name: the Red Terror. Following an assassination attempt on Lenin in August of 1918, the Cheka was unleashed with a fury that shocked even this jaded, war-torn nation. The Red Terror was not just about punishing the guilty. It was about terrorizing the entire population into a state of absolute submission. Hostage taken became standard practice. The Cheka would arrest the wives and children of army officers who had gone to fight for the other side, threatening to execute them if the men did not surrender. Summary executions became a daily occurrence. People were shot for being of the wrong social class, for having the wrong accent, for owning a book in French. The cellars of Cheka headquarters, most famously the Lubyanka building in Moscow, became abattoirs. The official justification was that the revolution was in danger and that any means were necessary to defend it. In reality, it was the systematic elimination of an entire social order. In the face of this new, terrifying reality, our world fractured. For men of my class, there were essentially three options. The first was to try to accommodate oneself to the new regime, to keep one's head down, to surrender one's property and hope to be left alone. This was a strategy adopted by the timid, and it rarely worked. The Bolsheviks had long memories and a deep-seated hatred for the former people, as they called us. Sooner or later, the knock on the door would come. The second option was to fight. All across the vast expanse of Russia, from the plains of Siberia to the shores of the Black Sea, resistance began to form. Former Tsarist generals, men like Kornilov, Denikin, and Kolchak, began to assemble volunteer armies, the nucleus of what would become the White Movement. They were a disparate collection of monarchists, liberals, disgruntled socialists, and anyone else who had a reason to hate the Bolsheviks. Their goal was simple: to strangle Lenin's infant regime in its cradle and restore a united and indivisible Russia. And so, the Civil War began, a conflict that would make the Great War look like a schoolyard scuffle. The third option, and the one that seemed increasingly sensible as the weeks went on, was to flee. A great, desperate exodus of the Russian nobility began. We fled with whatever we could carry: a few jewels sewn into the lining of a coat, a handful of foreign currency, a fading photograph of the life we were leaving behind. We traveled by any means necessary, on foot, by crowded refugee trains, on rickety boats crossing the Black Sea. The destinations were varied: Paris, Berlin, Constantinople, Shanghai, anywhere that was not here. The journey was a nightmare. We were hunted by red patrols, preyed upon by bandits, and ravaged by disease. I know of a princess of the Dolgorukov line who made her way to Finland on a peasant sledge, disguised as a servant, her diamonds hidden in a bar of soap. A count I once played cards with at the English club sold his wife's pearls for a place on a leaky steamer out of Odessa. It was a humiliating, terrifying scramble for survival. We were no longer princes and counts. We were refugees, stateless and destitute, scattered across the globe like autumn leaves in a bitter wind. This flight was not just a physical escape, it was an admission of defeat. We were abandoning the land our ancestors had governed for centuries, leaving it to the mercy of these new, ruthless masters. But to stay was to risk a far worse fate. I hear Siberia is lovely this time of year, for those who still have fingers and toes. The Cheka has a particular fondness for creative interrogation techniques, and their labor camps are not known for their creature comfort. The choice between a life of exile in a Parisian garret and a slow death in a Siberian mine is not a difficult one to make. And so the new reality has settled upon us like a shroud. The initial, almost farcical chaos of the revolution has given way to a grim, organized terror. The future is no longer a question of which politician will give the most eloquent speech. It is a question of whose firing squad you will end up in front of. The game has changed. The vodka is still flowing, but the guns are now all in the hands of one party, and Lenin is not just at the gate, he is in the master's study, rewriting the rules of the house, and we, the former masters, are now the ghosts, haunting the hallways of a home that is no longer ours. If you are still processing this dizzying, terrifying turn of events, if the abrupt transition from political farce to systematic terror has left your head spinning, then you are not alone. Our world has been turned inside out, and the story is far from over. Be sure to subscribe to our broadcast. We will continue to report from the heart of this darkness for as long as we are able. Hit that notification bell so you do not miss the next chapter in our descent. You must subscribe to bear witness to the birth of this new, monstrous world. The static is growing louder now, isn't it? It has been my constant companion throughout these broadcasts, the sound of a world crackling and burning at the edges. But now it feels different, more insistent. It's trying to swallow my voice, to swallow the past. And underneath it, if you listen closely, you can hear the new soundtrack of Russia, the distant, triumphant drone of revolutionary anthems, sung with a fervor that is as impressive as it is utterly terrifying. The air itself feels colder, thinner, as if the very soul of our nation is being bled out. We have come a long way together, you and I. From the first, almost comical wobbles of the empire, through the farcical ineptitude of our provisional government, to the grim finality of this new regime. We have talked of war and hunger, of mad monks and weak-willed Tsars. We have charted a course through a sea of chaos, and now we find ourselves washed ashore on a strange and hostile coast. The landscape is painted in one color, and one color only. Red. Red flags, red banners, red stars, and, if you look closely at the gutters, red stains in the snow. It is a peculiar thing to bear witness to the end of your own world. One expects thunder and lightning, a great operatic finale. Instead, it was a series of pathetic whimpers, bad decisions, and quiet, bureaucratic takeovers. The autocracy did not fall. It simply rotted from the inside out, and then collapsed under its own weight. We, the nobility who once believed our right to rule was ordained by God himself, found that our power was a fragile illusion easily shattered by a hungry mob and a few determined men with a simple, brutal idea. Our journey has been defined by three key elements, has it not? The vodka, the guns, and the man who arrived on that fateful train. The vodka was our great national anesthetic, the balm we applied to the gaping wound of our reality. For the peasant it was a release from toil, for us a shield against despair. It blurred the edges of the abyss, but it could not make it disappear. And then came the guns, the great democratizers of violence. The war spewed them out across the land, and suddenly every man was his own army, his own law. They were the tools that turned discontent into armed insurrection. And then Lenin arrived. He was the final ingredient, the catalyst that focused all the free lab of rage, despair, and violence into a single sharp point. He looked like a disgruntled professor, talked like a prophet of doom, and promised everyone everything. He was the eye of the hurricane, the cold, calculating center around which the storm of revolution finally coalesced. And now the storm has passed, and we are left in the eerie, unnerving calm of his total victory. The chaos of revolution is being replaced by the order of terror. The new masters are efficient, I will grant them that. They are masters of the list, the decree, the midnight arrest. The Cheka sees everything, and its justice is without appeal. My friends, my family, the people I once shared champagne and laughter with, are now scattered. Some are in Paris, selling their last remaining jewels. Some are in the south, trying to rally the shattered remnants of our army, and many, many are simply gone, vanished into the cellars of the Lubyanka, their names now just a whisper in a climate of fear. This broadcast, this foolish little act of defiance, has become a dangerous indulgence. And so, as the glorious sun of the Romanovs sets for the last time, and a very red star rises to take its place, this has been Count Fyodor Volkov, your humble and now thoroughly disenfranchised broadcaster from the final days of an empire. We saw the vodka flow, the guns flash, and Lenin indeed arrive at the gate, and now he is very much inside the gate. He has walked through the halls of the Kremlin, and he carries a long list with a great many names on it. I have a dreadful suspicion mine might be one of them. If this desperate, darkly humorous transmission from the brink of a new era has given you a moment of grim amusement, or perhaps a profound appreciation for your own era's lack of immediate revolutionary purges, then my purpose has been served. Keep listening to the whispers of history, keep questioning the grand narratives, and for the sake of whatever God is still paying attention, keep that subscribe button pressed. Because even when the old world burns to ashes, the stories and the occasional bottle of good spirits remain. Until the next broadcast, if they don't find my transmitter first, das Vidanya.